New Mexico is firmly in the Biden column, with the Democrat notching a 10-point win on Tuesday. The state's blue wave of 2018 ebbed somewhat, though, as Republican Yvette Herrell ousted Democrat Xochitl Torres-Small by an 8-point margin in the 2nd Congressional District. And while Ben Ray Lujan is headed to the U.S. Senate, his margin of victory over political neophyte Mark Ronchetti was just 5 points. What do the results say about New Mexico? The Line is here to offer opinions. We've got a great panel today, starting with UNM political science professor Lana Atkinson. We also welcome back Martha Burke, political psychologist and author of the book Your Voice, Your Vote. And completing our virtual table is Merritt Allen. She's the owner of Vox Optima Public Relations. Thank you all for joining in today. Now, let me go back to the 2nd Congressional District. That seat was always going to be tenuous for Ms. Xochitl Torres-Small. In the end, it wasn't close, Merritt. Does it feel like she lost or that Ms. Herrell won? What was your take on that?
Well, absolutely, Yvette Herrell won, and I just couldn't be more pleased. I've had the pleasure of knowing Yvette Herrell for years, and it was a brutal primary. It was a brutal general election, and I think it really reflects the view and the desire of the 2nd Congressional District. And what's interesting is, I think the more pertinent question is, was that a Democrat versus Republican battle? And it was not. It was a Republican versus Republican battle. And my point there is that was largely a fight in the primary between two warring factions in the Republican Party. And even in the general election, the defeated candidate in the primary, that campaign worked against Yvette Herrell in the general election as well. And that faction was also, of course, working on the Ronchetti campaign. So what that means for the current powers that be in the state Republican Party, I think will be interesting. Since I moved back here in 2005, I've been fascinated to watch that often, except for a few breaks, the state Republican Party seems to be less occupied with getting folks elected than controlling what Republicans we have left. It's been an interesting surge in the South. And I've also been frustrated in what has seemed to me to be a concentration on the Albuquerque Metro and not much else.
Yeah.
I feel like the groundswell between Yvette Herrell's election and Crystal Runyon-Diamond's election shows, I think the state party is focusing where a lot of their voters are, which is the South. They got great results. And I also want to note, I don't know if everybody caught that Harry Teague wound up endorsing Yvette Herrell a few weeks ago. And that was a very interesting endorsement from a former Democrat holder of the office. So
I
again,
realized that.
It wasn't even a Democrat versus Republican race to me in many ways.
Lana, pick up on that if you would. What's interesting, Merritt's talking about the feel of things here. What was it about for Ms. Torres-Small that just didn't punch through this time around? Was there something in the demographics that changed in the interim? What happened there?
Certainly, if we look at the data, we can see compared to 2016 that in 2018, the stronghold areas of Republicans in the South were depressed in terms of turnout. And so I think that was one factor that helped to get Torres-Small in. Another factor was an incredible campaign that went on by the Democrats. Of course, in this race, everyone was doing mail voting. So, that was not the same. Mobilization efforts were strong on both sides. I think that was a big factor as well. I think another thing is that, the Democrats did spend a lot of time, basically defeating Republicans, or defeating conservative Democrats in that district. And I think that in some ways sent a message about, what Democrats wanted from that district, and that they wanted someone more progressive than Xochitl Torres-Small. There was things about that. And I think that tension probably also hurt Torres-Small in the election campaign.
Martha, there's been some talk out there that Ms. Torres-Small just really wasn't true to herself, or maybe better said, the way she presented herself wasn't quite truly who she was. There was a lot of gun plays, a lot of Republican light. You might as well have thrown a bucket of red paint on the screen every time one of her ads started. How impactful was that? And again, to pick up on Lana's point, did she just not fit the times, literally?
Well, there were a couple of other things at play in the race, but to your point, Gene, she ran a lot of gun ads when in the election that she won.
Fair enough.
It irritated me greatly, I'll have to say, as a Democrat when I would see it. So that part had not changed a whole lot.
But did they take that too far this cycle?
A lot of the hypocrisy of it. They did indeed. But I want to say, where the Republicans really killed it in this election, two things. They registered a whole lot more new Republicans, and they got out there and got the turnout. It was not reported widely, but they organized a group of women voters to go door to door for Harrell. And that was something they had not done before. And that combined with the great upsurge in the registration that they put on, I think made a big difference as well. In terms of the ads and not true to yourself and this and that, I thought it was one of the most negative campaigns on both sides that we had in the whole state. But I think that this is the time when we just got to give it to the Republicans on their ground game to get out there, register people, and then make sure the ones that did register got there to the polls.
Gotcha. Well said. Merritt, let's talk about Mark Ronchetti. Interestingly, that Senate race went the way most people thought it would, but a 5-point race is narrower than the polls we saw, certainly, and he outperformed the president here in the state. I want to pick up on how he did, but also in the future for Mark Ronchetti. Could he have done something a little bit differently to close that 5-point gap, or was that just going to be the ceiling and that was that?
Well, I certainly think, and this is a trend we saw in nationwide in the Senate and House races. If you look at really a major Democratic loss in the House and the Senate staying relatively the same with a few seats swapping out, but roughly the numbers staying the same as to where they were in 2018. I think a lot of moderate Republicans who have a personal dislike of President Trump split their ballot, and so were comfortable not voting for Trump, but wanted to keep Republicans in the Senate and the House. Ronchetti came in with statewide recognition from his television career. I don't think he brought a lot of depth to the campaign on issues, but he was supported by a veteran campaign team, got Susana Martinez elected twice, and ran a very moderate campaign. So not an extreme conservative, which for Albuquerque and northern New Mexico is important. Had the support of the Albuquerque Republican establishment, which is also important.
Sure.
So from that perspective, yes, that's true. I think it would have been an uphill battle for any Republican because, as you noted before taping, Ben Ray Lujan knows how to fundraise. And he knows how to campaign. He certainly showed that as the Democratic congressional campaign chair.
I mean, Merritt, I'm interested to know if you thought the previously mentioned ground game for CD2 might have helped Mr. Ronchetti as well.
I don't know that. I don't know that carried over. I don't think the Republicans are not as well organized in Bernalillo County. They are in the rural areas, but I think in the Albuquerque Metro, there are some grassroots efforts with individual candidates who do some really impressive things. But as organizations go, the attention was not spent by the New Mexico GOP up north, nor on the Senate campaign. Really, New Mexico GOP was focused on Harrell primarily. That was for GOP from my perspective.
Understood. Yeah, even in hindsight, I can understand that. Lana, pick up on that if you would. What happened there for Mr. Ronchetti? Was that just his natural ceiling, or was there something else lurking in the numbers that he could have taken advantage of?
Well, I mean, obviously Walsh is potential spoiler there. There were maybe 24,000 votes for him. That wouldn't have put him over, but if more than half of those, which I would believe would have gone to the Republican, he would have had more votes. So there was a spoiler in that race that probably added a dimension to him that is important to consider.
Martha, let's talk about who won, which would be Ben Ray Lujan, certainly. It wasn't quite the winning going away as some people anticipated there. Does that handicap him at all going into this, or the fact that it just doesn't matter at the end of the day what the margin was?
I don't think it matters a whole lot. I think it was a surprise to me, as it was to most people, I think, that it was not a larger margin, but 5% is pretty big these days anyway. I mean, it was never that close. Ronchetti, I didn't think he had anything going for him except name recognition. And so that was a factor, I think. Ben Ray is a seasoned politician. He knows how the government works. He knows how to function in the government. He has proven that. I think that people relate to that. It sort of irritated me that Ronchetti seemed to want his family to be running as much as himself, and I did not think that was a very good strategy. I know Ben Ray is a single guy, and so he didn't have the family to trot out, but he didn't need it. He has functioned well as a representative. I think he is absolutely a natural for the office that he won, and I think the voters knew that.
Gotcha.
And let's not forget, the Lujans are a dynasty, so that's pretty hard to break into. I mean, my God, he practically grew up in the roundhouse.
Exactly.
So
he knows how the levers of power work.
The only surprise to me, Gene, was the margin. That's
Gotcha. I've got to bring this on the table with the three guests we have here for sure, but let me just kind of go through this. New Mexico now has 4 of 5 seats in the House or Senate held by minorities, with Yvette Herrell and Deb Haaland. It has 2 Native women in Congress, and all 3 congressional seats are held by women of color. Lana, let me start with you. How does that resume feel to you, and what does that say about New Mexicans and how we vote?
I think it says a lot about our state and our state's diversity. We have a really high percentage of Native Americans, relatively speaking, around 10%. So it's so great that we can have 2 Native Americans in office and 2 from different parties. That is a complete first. I mean, and I think it talks to the diversity of opinion within different cultures and different ideas. And I think that's really an important statement, not only about New Mexico, well, especially about New Mexico and the candidates that we choose.
Merritt, real quick, if I can do 20 seconds with you and Martha on this.
Just, I think it just shows in general, being a candidate is so hard and so stressful. And I just think it shows women have the resilience to withstand this, perhaps more so than men. Science shows that women have better endurance.
I'm not going to argue that. I've witnessed that. Absolutely. Martha Burke, what's your sense of where we sit now as a state?
That I love about it, the ethnicity notwithstanding, is that women candidates, female candidates, are now starting to be seen as normal at last. People don't think it's a big deal anymore when a woman goes after a seat. And that's really a changeover as recently as 20 years ago. So I think that's a significant factor that we all need to pay attention to. It's amazing that we have 3 women in the House of Representatives.
Interestingly, on the national scale, congressional Republicans, women had a night for themselves as well. It's very interesting. All right, we're back in just a moment to talk about legislative races. See you in a second.